Hi, if you're here and you're watching this video, that means that you're looking for some AP Computer Science A Prep. If you don't already know me, my name is Aditya Anandan. I'm a senior at Irvington High School in Fremont, California. Last year, I took the AP CSA exam digitally and I got a 5. So I think I have a pretty good understanding of what it takes to get a 5 on the exam and how you should prepare and what content you need to prepare. If you're on my YouTube channel, make sure to go check out my Thinkific course. We have practice quizzes, we have worksheets, we have practice tests, and we have these conceptual overview videos that you're going to be watching. We also have some breakdowns on MCQs and FRQs that are going to be really helpful for how to think through problems and how exactly to solve them. So without further ado, let's get to the lesson. Okay, so let's get started with Unit 2. So the main concepts we're going to be focusing on Unit 2 are centered around iteration or loops. But before all of that, let's get started with a simple concept with APCSA, and that concept is output. So how exactly do we show an output in Java? And how we do that is through a command called system.out.print. So within this, you have a parentheses and you will have quotation marks with some text inside. So you can have any text within here. So you can have a name, which is my name, Aditya, or you could have any string that you want. You could say gamer. You could say, as many people do, how they start off programming is with hello world, right? So you can have anything you want here. It can be however long you want. There are two variations of this command. There is print and then there is println. Println simply just adds a line. It simply just breaks your text. So if you were to say system.out.println Aditya, so you would say Aditya, and then it would move immediately to the next line down. So if you simply use print, every consecutive print command will be on the same line until you use print.ln. But print.ln, it moves to the next line. Okay? So that's pretty much it. There are some ways that you might want to like manipulate your text. What this does is this breaks your text. So if you have Aditya dot ln dot backslash n Anandin within here, what this would do is this would print my first name on the first line and my last name in the second line. Okay, so that's what this does. The second one is this quotations marks thingy. So whatever you do within these quotation marks will be in quotation marks. It's just because Java gets confused because we already have quotation marks in here. So you need to specify that through this command. And the last one is just plain old backslash. So to do that, we need to do this, and then a backslash will appear. One backslash will appear. All right. So the next topic that I do want to cover is iteration. And with iteration, the first thing that I'm going to talk about is an if loop. Or not an if loop, it's called an if statement in APCSA. So an if statement is pretty important to programming in general. This actually might be the most important concept that you're going to learn in APCSA because if statements are very, very key to programming in general. So an if statement, it's structured like this. The syntax is if something, and then you have some code here. Make this a comment, and then you close the bracket. It has to be a bracket. All right. So if something, this is running. So think of it like this. So if this top part is satisfied, if yes, then code runs. Okay. So this code is now dependent. It's now linked to whatever is here, and whatever is in there can be anything. It can be equals to, it can be greater than or equal to, it can be a compare to method. It doesn't matter. So let's just say we define a variable called num and we set it equal to 5, right? So now we have an if statement saying if num equals to 5, then you would say we have another, let's just suppose we have another variable called count and we set it to 0 sometime before. We'll just say count plus plus. Suppose that there's a variable called count, so I'm just going to write it here, count equals to 0 int count. Suppose that you have this variable count and it's equal to 0, and then you close the bracket. Now, because num is equal to 5, count will increment because of this loop, because the if loop checks whether num is equal to 5, and only if that's the case will it increment count. So now count from 0 will become 1. You can do the same thing with, there's another function called an else if statement. What that does is that will check for another value, and that will do count minus. Let's just suppose this time it'll check if count is equal to 3. And if so, what it'll do is it'll decrement count now by 1. This could be anything you want it to be, right? So an else if statement is simply just extending this if statement, and it's adding more. What the hell? Okay, it's adding another it's adding another check for it. So it's checking for another value, right? So this if statements can be anything, all right? So they can be greater than or equal to, they can be less than or equal to, they can be a bunch of different methods. It doesn't really matter. But for now, all you need to know about if statements and else if statements is that they take a condition and they check if that condition is true and they let some code run. The final thing that we're going to talk about here are else statements. So else statements, they only run if the if statement is false. So they will run exclusively only, they will run only if the if statement is false. So if this is false, then this runs. But if this is true, that'll not run. So if that counts for both of these, all right? So like only if both of these are false will the else statement run, because this is extending the if statement. All right, so this could be whatever you want. It could be plus equal to 2. I don't know. It could be something, right? So all you need to know now is that these three blocks represent three different types of conditionals. So first you've got the if statement, then you've got the elif statement, and then finally you've got the else statement. All right, so just know these three things. They're fairly simple concepts, except they will get more complicated as we get into more tough concepts. All right, so it's good just get that basic understanding. Next thing we're going to talk about is a for loop. Now, a for loop is pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward, but it's a little bit more complicated than if statement. So I'm just going to create a basic for loop here. So let's code. So again, we have something on the top, just like the if statement. We have like a heading for the loop, and in this heading, we have all this weird stuff going on. I don't know, like you might be thinking, what in the world is going on in here? But actually, the stuff is it's just simply just an inequality you learned in math, right? So you first got int I equals to 0. You're defining a new variable called I, and you're setting that equal to 0. But now what you're doing is you're checking if I is less than 5, and then you're incrementing I. So these things are 3 steps to a process that is going to run your code for a certain amount of time. All right. So what the for loop is going to do is it's going to run your code for a certain amount of loops. Okay, so it's going to run it for a certain amount of loops, and that is defined by this heading. So every time the loop runs, this thing will increment by 1. So int I will increment by 1. So the first time the loop runs, I will be equal to 0. But the second time the loop runs, it would have incremented by 1. Then it'll be 2. And it'll go all the way up to 5. But when it gets to 5, the loop notices that it's not less than 5 anymore. Because since it's not less than 5, this whole thing breaks and the code doesn't run. So every time every time the variable I will satisfy the inequality or the conditional right here, this conditional, this code will run that many times. Okay, so these code, the heading and whatever's inside, it sort of iterates through the code as many times as is defined through the heading. So that's pretty much all you need to know for loops. There is something called a nested for loop, which means you will have one big for loop called an outer for loop, and then you will have a tiny baby for loop, which is nested inside. Int j equals to 5. You can also do it the opposite way. You can like go backwards. So I'll do that here. So I greater than 0, I minus minus. So here, look at this inner loop here. We'll have some code here. So they might ask you a question like this here, where they'll have like a nested for loop and they'll say what is printed. So what you need to know is you need to go through the top part and you need to check what exactly is going on in the top part. What is the first variable here? And that is defined through this one, I equals to 0. That's what it's setting it to. So the first time I equals to 0, but now this first time, all of this is going to run, okay? But all of this is going to run. That means this whole for loop is going to run for one time the outer loop runs. So the inner loop is going to run fully for one time of the outer loop, all right? It'd be better if I just show you. All right, so you have int I equals to 0, int, and then you have int j equals to 5. So for this one, int I equals to 0, but now within that, within this big int I equals to 0, you have int j equals to 5, and the code is running. Int j equals to 4, the code keeps running. Keep looking at this one. Keep looking at the this one right here. This one. Int j equals to 3. Int j equals to 2. Int j equals to 1. But when it gets to 0, what it'll do is it'll break because it has to be greater than 0, as specified in the loop heading. So the code is, and then obviously then it goes back to the outer loop, and then int I now equals to 1, and the whole thing repeats again. Okay, so that this concept is pretty important because there's definitely going to be some questions about nested for loops. I presume so because I think it's a good way of testing your understanding of loops because you have to know exactly how to read for loops and how to iterate through them and understand how they work. So so just understand the basics and how it's working and what each part of the for loop means, and you should be fine. Okay. The last loop that we're going to talk about is called a while loop. What a while loop is that it's simply just another type of loop, but this time, instead of it being a set amount of loops, it's defined through a conditional. So while we'll define a variable called count. I'm sorry, this is not spaced correctly at all. We'll make it 6. So while count greater than equal to 5. So within this while loop, what you need to do is you need to modify count so that this while loop is not satisfied, because otherwise the while loop will run infinitely, and we do not want that. This is the problem with while loops that I think is kind of annoying, is that they are very hard to keep track of, because if you make a small mistake and you sort of forget where you're going, what can happen is that this can run infinitely, and we do not want that. We do not want an infinite while loop, because otherwise our code won't run. So something within this while loop needs to make sure that count is going down, right? Count is equal to 6. We need to make sure that it goes down to 4 or something less than 5, right? So that's the what while loops do is that they make sure that your code keeps running. So there's no, you're not setting it directly, but you can change your code within the while loop. You can have nested if statements. You can even have some for loops to modify that variable, so that ultimately what you will get is that this condition is no longer satisfied and you can exit the loop. But somehow, some way, you need to get to that end result where this is not satisfied. Okay. So that's pretty much what while loops are. There are multiple practice problems on the internet as to like how while loops work, and the I'm sure like if you're using a review textbook, they must have talked about this, and you it's a fairly simple concept. Right. The next thing is I think we're done with iteration. The only thing you need to just remember these concepts, especially the if statements, for loops, and while loops. The nested for loops, yeah. Also do the nested for loops. Also remember everything that I said about iteration, essentially, because it's pretty important, and they'll likely ask you a bunch of questions about it. All right. So the next topic that I want to discuss is strings. So, how do you define a string? A string is defined just like a variable, but this time you use a capital S instead of a lowercase s, as you might have thought that's the case, but this is the name. So the name can be whatever you want it to be, and this can be whatever it's referring to. It can be a name, it could be my name, it could be Jeff, it could be Bob, it could be Billy, I don't know. It could be Billy, Bob, Joe, I don't know. It could be whatever. It could be any string that you want it to be. All right. And a string is not a variable. Keep this in mind because we will discuss this later in a later lecture. String is a class, and a class is an overarching hierarchy which will have multiple sub methods, and it's all just a bunch of mumbo jumbo to you right now. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't understand a single word that I just said. Just know that a string is not a variable. That's all you need to know right now. And once we get into classes and once we get into methods, everything should become clear. All right. So just know how to define a string, how to, print strings through the system that print thing that we defined earlier. And yeah, that's pretty much all that we have with strings. Now, we do have something called a math class, and this math class is pretty important because there is a singular function called math.random that we do use quite a bit. So they might ask you, like, get a value, a random value between 5 and 10. And how you would do that is, so let's first go over what math.random does. So math.random returns a random number from 0 to 1, where 0 is inclusive and 1 is exclusive. Okay, so that is exactly, so it'll go all the way to 0.99999. Okay, so you will get a random value from 0 to 1, and what you have to do is you have to use that to generate a random value between 5 and 10. So to do that, you multiply math.random by the outside thing minus the by the large value minus the small value. So the large minus the small is now 5. So it's 5 times math.random, and then you add the lower value. So what this will do is this will essentially make sure that the minimum value will be 5 and the maximum value will be very, 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 very close to 10. All right. And that's pretty much it. I think they might ask you get an integer, and if that's the case, you need to add 1 here. So if they change this to an integer, what you will have to do is you will have to add 1 to this thing that you're multiplying math.random by, because it has to be greater than the math is not really that important. It's all about like understanding what math.random is. The exact math of getting to this answer, what I did, is not really that important. I don't think they expect you to know that. I just think they expect you to know what math.random is and how exactly it works. I mean, and I think I explained that to you right now, right? It's just returning a random value between 0 and 1, where 0 is inclusive, which means you can get 0, and 1 is exclusive, which means you can't get 0. There is also math.power, like square root, stuff like that. I mean, there are a lot of different math uh, methods and functions that you can use, but I think math.random is the most important one that most commonly comes up in the AP exam. The final thing is integer class. This is not similar to it's not the same as int, which the integer variable that we discussed in the previous lecture. The integer class is simply just it's a class form of the integer variable. It has the same value, but essentially you can manipulate the integer variable in different ways than the integer. You can manipulate the integer class in more ways that you can manipulate the integer variable. But there are some cool things that you can do with it. The only thing that I want you to know from this is integer dot min value. This returns a very, very small negative. Sorry, very, very large. Sorry, I meant large. Very, very large negative is like -2 something. It like goes on forever. It does not forever. It goes on for a large thing. It's very large. What this is used for is that it's used to sort of compare other values in the data set. So what min value is used for is that you will use min value to check whether other values in a data set are greater than, and if so, you will return some value and you will know that your data set is true, right? And it contains a value. So I don't know if they'll ask you questions about this exactly, but it's always good to know these like small tidbits and facts about this. Max value does the same, except it returns a really big, it returns a large positive number. So yeah, these are just two of the properties of the integer class. All right, I think that's pretty much it for everything that is there to Unit 2. Unit 2 is super important because Unit 1, there's pretty much no substance to Unit 1. You can not do Unit 1 and still get a 5 on the exam. But if you don't do Unit 2, if you don't have a good foundational understanding of Unit 2, you're going to be in a lot of trouble for the exam, because I would say about 60 to 70% of the exam is focused on loops and strings and all of that stuff. All right, so gaining this understanding is super important. Make sure to just know all of this stuff. Uh, and yeah, that's pretty much it. If you guys have any questions, any comments on what you think I should cover, what you think would be most helpful for you, leave it below in the comment section. Also, check out my Thinkific course if you're not already on. If you are, thank you so much for supporting me. And yeah, make sure to have a great day. Peace out.